And Alice, her parents, and her older sister Natalie, who is 17, are vacationing at a lake in upstate New York. They're staying at a cabin of friends, a cabin that they rent every year, but this year Alice finds there's something very, very different. August 1963. Alice haunted the mossy edge of the woods, lingering in patches of shade. She was waiting to hear his Austin Healey throttling back as he careened down the utility road, separating the string of cabins from the state park rimming the lake. But there was only the conversation of buntings in the cathedral of branches overhead. Pine seedlings brushed against her pants as she pushed through the understory, their green heads vivid beneath the canopy. She had dressed to fade into the forest. Her hair was bundled up under a long-billed cap, her clothes drab and inconspicuous. When at last she heard his car, she crunched behind a clump of birch and made herself as small as possible, settling into a shallow depression of ferns and leaf litter. Balancing her birding diary and a book of poetry in her lap, she watched as he wheeled into the graveled parking space at the head of his property. He shut off the engine but stayed in the convertible and lit a cigarette, smoking it slowly, his eyes closed for so long she wondered if he had fallen asleep or maybe drifted into one of his moody trances. When he finally unfolded himself from the cramped front seat, he was as straight and narrow as the trunks behind him, the dark, even mass of them swallowing his shadow. Alice twitched, her left foot gone to pins and needles. The movement caused no more disturbance than a small animal, but he immediately turned to where she was hidden and stared at a spot directly above her head while she held her breath. "Alice," he whispered into the warm air. She could just hear the hiss of it, could barely see his lips moving, but she was sure he had said her name. He lifted a single paper bag from the passenger seat, cradling it close to his chest, almost lovingly. Bottle, she decided, thinking of her father and his many trips back and forth between the car and their own cabin, carefully ferrying the liquor he'd brought, enough for a month's worth of toasts and nightcaps and morning after hair of the dogs. She waited until Thomas had navigated the short flight of flagstone steps and the screen door banged shut behind him before she moved, choosing a soft mound of earth pillowed with needles. She scratched at a mosquito bite and opened the book of poetry to read it again. Mrs. Phelan, the librarian, had set it aside for her when it first came in. Alice had saved the book for the lake, not wanting to read any of the poems until she was in exactly the right surroundings. On the dock that morning, she grabbed a towel, still faintly damp and smelling of algae, and stretched out on her stomach, resting on her elbows as she thumbed through the book. The glare of sunlight off the crisp pages gave her a headache, but she stayed where she was, letting the heat paint her skin a tender pink. She kept reading, holding her breath after each stanza, focusing on the language, on the precise meaning of the words, regretting that she could only imagine what had been meant as opposed to knowing with any certainty. Now the page with the poem, No Voyage, was wrinkled, pocked from specks of sand, its corner imprinted with the damp mark of Alice's thumb. I lie like land used up. There were secrets in the lines she couldn't puzzle out. If she asked, Thomas would decipher the poem for her without resorting to the coddling speech adults often used, choosing vague words and pretending confusion. The two of them bartered their knowledge during her visits. He schooled her in jazz, in bossa nova and bebop, playing his favorites for her while he painted, stabbing the air with his brush when there was a particular passage he wanted her to note. In turn, she showed him the latest additions to her birding diary, her sketches of the short-eared owl and American widgeon, the cedar waxwings and late warblers. She explained how the innocent-looking loggerhead shrike killed its prey by biting its quarry in the back of the neck, severing the spinal cord, and then impaling the victim on thorns or barbed wire and tearing it to shreds. Good grief, he'd said, shuddering. I'm in the clutches of an avian Vincent Price. She suspected their conversations only provided him with reasons to procrastinate, but she made him laugh with her descriptions of the people in town. Tamara Filson, who wore her long strand of pearls everywhere, even to the beach, after reading of a burglary in the neighboring town. The Sidby twins, whose parents dressed them in matching clothes, from the barrettes in their hair down to the laces in their sneakers, the only distinguishable difference between the two being a small purple dot Mr. Sidby had penned under the earlobe of one. "You, Alice," Thomas said, "are my most reliable antidote to boredom." She peered through the birch trunks toward the back of the house. She would never have gone over without an invitation, but one had been extended, at least in general terms. "Come over and visit," he'd said to her family that first day, introducing himself on the dock the property shared, appearing from the woods to retrieve the frenzied dog that circled his feet. But introductions weren't necessary, at least not on his part. They knew exactly who he was. The second two characters I'll introduce you to, and this is later on in the story. Dennis Finch is an art history professor, recently widowed, who's teaching at a college in upstate New York. And in October of 2007, he finds himself summoned by a longtime acquaintance, maybe a friend, maybe not, he's never been sure, the artist Thomas Baber. To his extreme disappointment, Baber sends Finch along with an eccentric young art authenticator named Stephen Jameson on a mission. Together, this odd couple, one of whom doesn't like to drive and the other who would prefer not to fly, set out on a quest to find the missing painting and the two sisters who are its subject. This is in December of 2007. Finch was green. He never really believed his own excuses for not flying, but to his humiliation, he'd succumbed to a full-on panic attack outside the terminal, desperately trying to reinsert himself into a cab that was already leaving. He and Stephen were pulled from the security line for extra screening, no doubt thanks to Stephen's black eye, which had turned a menacing aubergine, and Stephen's insistence on holding his boarding pass in front of his mouth while whispering instructions clearly audible to anyone within a 10-foot radius did nothing to endear them to the TSA. "Try not to look suspicious." I don't look suspicious. "You do. You're practically panting. It makes you look guilty of something." Finch hissed at him through clenched teeth. "I'm panting because I can't breathe." "We need oxygen over here," Stephen said loudly, waving in the direction of the security desk, despite the jabs Finch inflicted to his ribcage. "You're going to get us arrested." Other passengers had the sense to move away, leaving the two of them as an island in the security line, easily identifiable, easily tagged. Stephen looked wounded. "I'm only trying to help you overcome your phobia." "Don't help me." Their 2-hour flight was delayed an hour and 45 minutes, and the wait practically did Finch in. He sat in one of the molded plastic chairs with his eyes closed, palms sweating. Claire might have helped him, but he refused to summon her. He devised his own set of rules for penance, chief among these being when he was allowed to talk to her. Airports, airplanes, waiting in line for Chinese takeout, or to pick up prescriptions, these were not on the list. He refused to use a conversation with her as an antidote for boredom or to soothe his feelings of incapacitation. Instead, he limited their exchanges to those places she had loved: their kitchen table with the wobbly leg, Shakespeare Garden in Central Park, the holiday train show at the Haupt Conservatory, their bedroom, especially their bedroom. It wouldn't be fair to break his own rules and bring her here just because he was experiencing a minor breakdown. Stephen elbowed him, drawing Finch from his reverie. It wasn't this one, was it?" he said. His voice in Finch's ear had the whine of a dental drill, the shiver-inducing screech of crumpled foil. "This one what?" "This airport. I thought I asked you and you said it wasn't. You did say that, didn't you?" Finch clutched the edges of his chair. "Please stop talking." By the time boarding began, Stephen nearly had to carry him onto the plane. To make matters worse, he insisted on taking the aisle seat, telling Finch it was part of his flying ritual. Once they were airborne, Stephen downed several glasses of Bloody Mary mix, then moved all 3 air sickness bags to the pouch in front of the middle seat. "I feel it's a mistake to provide them. It's the power of suggestion. You see the bag, you feel ill. If you even check to see there is a bag, you're already anticipating the worst." He shifted closer to Finch and lowered his voice. "It's critical to be early in the boarding process so that you can move them before your seatmates arrive. For some reason, it makes them uneasy. I don't understand why. It's not as if I'm taking theirs." In response to Finch's raised brow, Stephen added, "Reposition is not taking, technically." Finch was sure his heart must have been exiting his chest. His hands were still slick with sweat, and the lingering smell of jet fuel made his stomach lurch. At least all three of the air sickness bags were now in front of him, for which he was increasingly grateful. The woman sitting in the window seat had pushed herself as far away from him as she could manage, legs tucked up, arms wrapped around her sides, her body a compressed sponge that would magically expand once they landed. "Here." Stephen shoved a small plastic box toward Finch before pulling an eye shade out of his carry-on and snapping it across his forehead. "What's this?" "I'm rather surprised you don't recognize them." Stephen pushed his call button and waved his empty glass at the flight attendant, who rolled her eyes. "And I'll take his peanuts," he added, pointing at Finch when she returned with more Bloody Mary mix. "Odds would seem high he's going to be ill." The woman in the window seat quickly pulled a blanket over her head. "Open it," Stephen said, gesturing at the box in Finch's hand. "They're acupressure bands. You helped me when we were driving to the cabin. I'm returning the favor. I hope you don't think I'm giving you a used pair. I had to open them up to make sure there were directions. Then the clerk insisted I purchase them. I would have preferred gray myself. Black seems funereal for an acupressure band." Finch hated to admit it, but he was touched. Why hadn't he thought of this? He pulled the bands over his hands and positioned them below his wrists. "It was thoughtful, Stephen. Thank you." Stephen shrugged. "Just remember this when you get behind the wheel for the 2-hour drive to wherever it is we're going." Finch started to tell him, but Stephen held up an index finger. "I'll get it. Just give me a moment." He squeezed his eyes shut and started mumbling. "Thanks. Thank you. Thanksgiving. Turkey. Wild turkey. Bourbon. No. Hunting wild turkey. Hunter." Stephen paused for a minute and then smiled and pulled his eyeshade down. "It's Orion," he said, and Finch could only shake his head.